December the 19th, 1944. The frozen crossroads village of Neuville, Belgium. 4 M18 Hellcat tank destroyers from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion raced down the ice-slicked roads at speeds approaching 50 miles per hour, their continental radial engines roaring through the pre-dawn darkness. Behind them, stretching back toward Bastogne, columns of American paratroopers and tanks struggled to keep pace. The Hellcats were running toward the sound of guns, toward a desperate defence that would help determine the fate of the entire Battle of the Bulge. What those 4 tank destroyers accomplished in the next 24 hours would validate every controversial decision that went into their creation. They would prove that in armoured warfare, sometimes the fastest gun wins, even against tanks that outweighed them by 15 tons and carried armour 3 times as thick. This is the story of the M18 Hellcat, the fastest tracked armoured vehicle of World War II, and how American speed defeated German steel. The story begins not on the battlefields of Europe, but in the frantic days of 1941, when American military planners watched in horror as German panzer divisions smashed through Poland, France, and drove deep into the Soviet Union. The blitzkrieg seemed unstoppable. Tank columns punched through defensive lines, encircled entire armies, and reached objectives hundreds of miles behind the front before defenders could react. American doctrine at the time called for towed anti-tank guns to defend against armour attacks. But France had towed anti-tank guns. Poland had towed anti-tank guns. Both fell in weeks. Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall recognised the problem immediately. Static defences couldn't stop mobile warfare. Infantry armed with anti-tank weapons would panic when faced with charging tanks. No matter how brave the soldiers, America needed its own mobile tank-killing force. In November 1941, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce took command of the Tank Destroyer Tactical and Firing Center at Fort Meade, Maryland. Bruce had a clear vision. He didn't want another tank. Tanks supported infantry, broke through defensive positions, exploited breakthroughs. What he wanted was something entirely different. A cruiser, not a battleship. A vehicle fast enough to maneuver around enemy tank columns, strike from unexpected angles, hit the flanks and rear where armour was thin, then disappear before the enemy could respond. Speed over armour, mobility over protection, hitting power over survivability. The philosophy was radical, even dangerous. Every military in the world was adding more armour to their tanks, making them heavier, slower, more survivable. Bruce wanted to go the opposite direction. Strip away armour, maximise speed, mount a gun powerful enough to kill enemy tanks, and trust that mobility would keep his tank destroyers alive. The motto became Seek, Strike, Destroy. Find the enemy tanks, hit them hard, get out fast. The early attempts were disasters. The M6 gun motor carriage mounted a 37mm gun on a modified truck. It was fast, mobile, and completely useless against German armour. The gun couldn't penetrate anything heavier than a light tank. The M3 gun motor carriage mounted a 75mm gun on a half-track. Better firepower, but the half-track couldn't keep up with tanks cross-country and offered no protection to its crew. By 1942, it was clear that a completely new design was needed. Enter Harley Earl's design studio at the Buick Motor Division of General Motors. Earl was famous for designing sleek, powerful automobiles. Now he would apply those principles to a tank destroyer. The design that emerged was revolutionary. Buick engineers used torsion bar suspension borrowed from European tank designs, providing a smooth ride at high speeds. They mounted the engine, a Continental R975 9-cylinder radial producing 400 horsepower, on steel rollers that allowed it to be pulled out for maintenance in the field. They paired it with an innovative Torquematic automatic transmission, something almost unheard of in military vehicles of the era. The turret was open-topped, sacrificing protection for visibility and weight savings. The armour was kept to an absolute minimum. The thickest armour on the vehicle was just 25mm, barely half an inch. The front hull armour was only 13mm thick, less than the M8 armoured car. An infantryman with a rifle grenade could penetrate it. But the weight savings were dramatic. The entire vehicle weighed just 17.5 tons, 12 tons lighter than a Sherman tank despite mounting the same 76mm gun. That low weight, combined with the powerful engine, produced something unprecedented. In testing at the General Motors Proving Grounds, The prototype reached 60 miles per hour on paved roads. Cross-country, it could sustain 30 to 40 miles per hour over terrain that bogged down heavier tanks. It could accelerate from 0 to 30 miles per hour in under 30 seconds. Its power-to-weight ratio exceeded every other tracked vehicle in the world. The Army called it the T-70. Buick called it the Hellcat. Production began in July 1943 at the Buick plant in Flint, Michigan. The initial order was for 1,000 vehicles. By October 1944, when production ended, Buick had delivered 2,507 Hellcats at a cost of $55,000 each, about $750,000 in today's money. But could it actually fight? The first Hellcats to see combat were 5 T-70 prototypes sent to Italy in spring 1944. The 894th Tank Destroyer Battalion received 3 of them during the Anzio breakout. The battalion commander immediately recognized a problem. His crews loved the speed and the powerful gun. They could get into firing positions faster than any other vehicle on the battlefield. The 76mm gun hit harder than anything on a Sherman tank, but the thin armour terrified them. German anti-tank guns could punch through the Hellcat's armour like paper. A near miss from artillery could disable it with fragmentation. The open top meant that small arms fire, grenades, even shrapnel from tree bursts could kill the crew. The 894th relegated their Hellcats to the reconnaissance company, using their speed for scouting rather than tank fighting. When word got back to the United States, many commanders questioned the entire concept. General Omar Bradley, commanding First Army in England, refused to equip his tank destroyer battalions with Hellcats when they were first offered. His units already had the M10 tank destroyer, based on the Sherman chassis with a 3-inch gun. The M10 was slow, but it was reliable, well armoured by comparison, and its gun could kill German tanks. Bradley wanted the new M36 mounting a 90mm gun. He had no interest in the fragile M18. As a result, the first 3 Hellcat battalions sent to Europe, the 603rd, 704th and 705th, were all assigned to General George Patton's Third Army. Patton, who believed in speed and aggressive action, was willing to try them. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had been the unit that tested the original T-70 prototypes. Their feedback had improved the design, strengthening weak points, improving the transmission, refining the turret. In July 1944, they arrived in Normandy equipped with production M18s. For the first 2 months, they saw little action in their intended role. The bocage country of Normandy, with its thick hedgerows and narrow lanes, wasn't terrain for fast-moving tank destroyers. The Hellcats were used for infantry support, blasting German positions with their 76mm guns, providing fire support for advancing troops. Crews complained about the open turret, which left them exposed to German snipers and artillery fragments. They complained about the lack of a coaxial machine gun to defend against infantry attacks. Most of all, they complained that they were being used as tanks, roles for which the Hellcat was never designed. Then came September 1944, and everything changed. Patton's Third Army had broken out of Normandy and was racing across France toward the German border. The 4th Armoured Division, spearheading the advance, crossed the Moselle River near Nancy and pushed toward the town of Aricourt. Hitler, desperate to stop Patton's advance, ordered a counter-offensive. The 5th Panzer Army, equipped with the latest Panther tanks, would strike the American spearhead and drive them back across the Moselle. The Panthers represented everything the Panther was supposed to be. 45 tons of German engineering, with sloped frontal armour 80mm thick that could deflect American tank shells at any range. A high-velocity 75mm gun that could penetrate the front armour of a Sherman at 2,000 metres. Good cross-country mobility despite its weight. The Americans called it the most dangerous tank in the German arsenal. On the morning of September 19, 1944, dense fog covered the area around Aricourt. Visibility was measured in yards. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper, commanding an M18 platoon from Company C, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, led his 4 Hellcats toward the village of Rechicourt-le-Petit. They were moving to support the 4th Armoured Division's command post, which intelligence suggested might be the target of a German attack. Leiper was moving slowly through the fog, trying to maintain formation, when suddenly a massive gun barrel materialized out of the mist 30 feet away. A Panther, part of the 113th Panzer Brigade, had driven almost directly into the American position. For a split second, both sides froze. Then training and instinct took over. Leiper's gunner traversed the turret, the hydraulic system whining. The Panther's crew, seeing the American tank destroyer, began their own traverse. But the Panther's turret traverse was slow, powered by a manual system that took precious seconds to bring the gun to bear. The Hellcat's hydraulic traverse was faster. The American gun fired first. The 76mm armor-piercing round, travelling at over 2,000 feet per second, struck the Panther's side armor. Unlike the nearly impenetrable frontal armor, the side plates were only 40mm thick. The shell punched through, detonating inside the tank. The Panther's ammunition exploded. The 45-ton tank came apart in a massive fireball. Before the smoke cleared, Leiper had spotted more shapes in the fog, Panthers moving in column formation, completely unaware that American tank destroyers were already among them. Leiper's platoon deployed rapidly, each Hellcat taking a firing position. The fog that had allowed the Germans to approach unseen now worked against them. They couldn't see the Hellcats, couldn't coordinate their response, couldn't bring their superior frontal armor to bear. Over the next 5 minutes, Leiper's platoon destroyed 5 Panthers. One M18 was hit and destroyed when a Panther got off a lucky shot, but the Germans were taking catastrophic losses. The fog, the terrain, and the Hellcat's superior speed and maneuverability had turned what should have been a German advantage into an American triumph. The engagement wasn't over. As the fog began to lift, more Panthers from the 113th Panzer Brigade pressed the attack, but Captain Tom Evans, commanding Company C, had positioned his other 2 platoons in concealed positions flanking the German approach. As the Panthers advanced toward what they thought was a small American force, they exposed their flanks to the hidden Hellcats. Evans' plan was simple and devastatingly effective. His lead platoon acted as bait, attracting German attention. When the Panthers turned to engage, they presented their vulnerable side armor to the concealed Hellcats. The moment a Panther began its slow turret, traversed toward one platoon, it exposed itself to fire from another. The German tanks, designed for long-range frontal engagements, found themselves in a close-range knife fight where their advantages meant nothing. A Panther could shrug off frontal hits from 76mm guns, but side armor was a different story. At ranges of 300 to 500 yards, the M18's gun could penetrate the Panther's side armor consistently. And the Hellcats could fire, relocate, and fire again before the German crews could react. Sergeant Henry Hartmann, commanding one of the M18s, became a legend that morning. His tank destroyer knocked out 6 Panthers, most at ranges under 400 yards. He would fire, reverse at high speed into a concealed position, move laterally behind cover, then emerge at a different angle for another shot. The Panthers, with their slow turret traverse and poor visibility to the sides, couldn't track him. By the time the Battle of Aracourt ended 3 days later, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had destroyed 39 German tanks. 4 M18s were destroyed, 3 more damaged. The kill ratio was nearly 10-1. News of the engagement spread through the American and German armies like wildfire. For the Americans, it validated the tank destroyer concept, and specifically the M18. Speed and maneuverability had defeated armor and firepower. For the Germans, it was a shocking revelation. The Panther, their most advanced tank, designed to be nearly invincible in frontal combat, had been massacred by lighter American tank destroyers. German after-action reports struggled to explain what had happened. Some German commanders blamed poor tactics, saying the Panthers should never have been caught in close terrain where they couldn't use their superior range. Others blamed the fog, saying visibility conditions had negated their advantages. But the truth was simpler and more disturbing. The M18 Hellcat, which many had written off as a fragile tank destroyer with insufficient armor, had found the Panther's weakness and exploited it ruthlessly. The Panther was designed for the Eastern Front, for the open steppes of Russia where engagements happened at ranges of 1 to 2 kilometers. There, its frontal armor and long-range gun were decisive. But in the close terrain of Western Europe, in forests and villages and rolling countryside where engagement ranges were measured in hundreds rather than thousands of meters, the Panther's advantages disappeared. The M18 could get to the flanks, could maneuver into positions where the Panther's frontal armor didn't matter. And once there, its gun was more than adequate to punch through. The The 76mm M1 gun on the Hellcat fired the same ammunition as the gun mounted on late-model Sherman tanks. Against frontal armour it struggled. The standard armour-piercing rounds could barely dent a Panther's front plate. But the Americans had a secret weapon, high-velocity, armour-piercing ammunition, or HVAP rounds. These used a tungsten carbide penetrator surrounded by a light metal support. They achieved higher velocities and better penetration than standard rounds. With HVAP ammunition, which began arriving in theatre in fall 1944, the Hellcat could theoretically penetrate even a Panther's frontal turret armour at ranges up to 1,000 metres. The problem was that HVAP rounds were always in short supply. Production of tungsten ammunition was limited, and priority went to units facing the heaviest German armour. Hellcat crews were rationed just a few HVAP rounds per vehicle. They had to make every shot count. But against side armour, even standard armour-piercing rounds were effective. The M62 armour-piercing capped ballistic cap round could penetrate 88mm of armour at 1,000 yards. The Panther's side armour was only 40 to 50mm thick. At the ranges typical in Western European combat, 3 to 500 metres, the Hellcat's gun could punch through side armour reliably. The real advantage of the M18 wasn't just its gun. It was the combination of speed, manoeuvrability, and firepower that made it deadly. The Hellcat could reach positions faster than any other armoured vehicle on the battlefield. It could accelerate rapidly, change direction quickly, reverse at high speed. In the time it took a Panther to traverse its turret 90 degrees, a Hellcat could fire, reverse into cover, and reposition for another shot. The hydraulic turret traverse on the M18 was another significant advantage. The Panther used a manual system, where the gunner had to physically turn a handwheel to rotate the turret. In optimal conditions, it could manage a full 360-degree rotation in about 60 seconds. But that required the tank to be on level ground. On a slope, or in rough terrain, traverse speed decreased dramatically. The M18's electrohydraulic system could traverse the turret a full 360 degrees in just 20 seconds, regardless of terrain. This meant that in a close-range engagement, the Hellcat could bring its gun to bear on targets much faster than its opponent. But the M18's advantages came at a steep price. That thin armour meant that anything could kill it. German anti-tank guns, tank guns, even heavy machine guns could penetrate the hull armour at close range. The open top meant that artillery airbursts, which wouldn't seriously damage a fully enclosed tank, could wound or kill the entire crew. And unlike a Sherman or a Panther, which could absorb multiple hits and keep fighting, a single penetrating hit on a Hellcat usually meant catastrophic damage. The crew compartment was so cramped that a shell detonating inside would likely kill everyone. Despite these vulnerabilities, crews who mastered the Hellcat came to love it. They appreciated the speed, which gave them control over engagements. They could choose when to fight and when to run. They appreciated the visibility from the open turret, which made it much easier to spot threats. They appreciated the powerful gun, which made them dangerous to any German tank they encountered. Most of all, they appreciated that the vehicle gave them a fighting chance through mobility rather than armour. As one crew commander put it, "I'd rather be fast and see everything than slow and blind." 2 months after Aracourt came the ultimate test of the Hellcat's capabilities. On December 16, 1944, Hitler launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, the massive counter-offensive through the Ardennes that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 600 tanks including Panthers and Tigers, smashed into the thinly held American lines. The goal was to reach the port of Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies and potentially forcing a negotiated peace. The key to the entire offensive was speed. German tanks had to seize the road network quickly, particularly the crossroads town of Bastogne, before American reinforcements could arrive. The 101st Airborne Division, trucked to Bastogne on short notice, was ordered to hold the town at all costs. But paratroopers, no matter how brave, couldn't stop panzer divisions alone. They needed armoured support. That's where the Hellcats came in. On December 19th, Team de Sobry, a battalion-sized task force from the 10th Armoured Division, was ordered to defend the village of Neuville, just 4 miles northeast of Bastogne. Holding Neuville would delay the German advance, buying time for the 101st to dig in around Bastogne proper. Team de Sobry had tanks and infantry, but they needed tank destroyers. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M18 Hellcats, was ordered to support them. 4 Hellcats raced to Noville in what would become one of the few documented cases where the M18's legendary top speed was actually used as intended. The roads were iced over, visibility was poor, and German forces were advancing rapidly. The Hellcats, capable of speeds approaching 60 miles per hour, raced ahead of the German columns and reached Noville just ahead of the enemy. Those 4 M18s, supporting Team de Zobry and the 1st Battalion of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, were about to face an entire Panzer division. The 2nd Panzer Division, one of Germany's elite armoured formations, was tasked with seizing Noville as part of the drive toward Bastogne. They expected to brush aside whatever light American forces they encountered. Instead, they ran into a buzzsaw. The Americans, outnumbered and outgunned on paper, turned Noville into a killing ground. The Hellcats used every advantage they had. The village's buildings provided cover and concealment. The Hellcats could hide behind structures, dash out to fire, then retreat before German tank guns could respond. Their speed allowed them to relocate constantly, appearing in different positions, making the Germans think they faced a much larger force than they actually did. The open turret, usually a liability, became an advantage in urban combat. The crews could see in all directions, could hear approaching tanks, could spot infantry trying to flank them. Over December 19th and 20th, those 4 Hellcats and their supporting American forces destroyed at least 30 German tanks. Estimates of German casualties ran between 500 and 1,000 men. A Military Channel documentary would later credit the M18s with 24 of those tank kills, including several Tigers. The ability to shoot and scoot, to fire and relocate at speeds the Germans couldn't match, confused and slowed the German attack. The 2nd Panzer Division, which should have brushed aside the American forces in hours, spent 2 days battering against Noville. By the time the Americans finally withdrew to Bastogne proper, the delay had been critical. The 101st Airborne was dug in. Patton's Third Army was racing north to relieve them. The German offensive, which depended on speed, had been slowed just enough to fail. The Hellcats' performance at Noville and throughout the Battle of the Bulge silenced most remaining critics. By December 25th, Christmas Day 1944, M18 battalions supporting the Bastogne defence had knocked out an additional 27 Panzers at a cost of just 6 Hellcats. The kill ratios were consistently favourable, often dramatically so, but the M18's combat record wasn't without controversy. Historian Stephen Zaloga would later characterise the overall design as poorly balanced, arguing that the Hellcat's success was attributable more to crew training and dedication than to the vehicle's design. He and other critics pointed out that the M18 was rarely used in its intended role. The massive German tank breakthroughs that tank-destroyer doctrine was designed to counter almost never materialised. Instead, M18 battalions were parcelled out to infantry divisions, where they provided direct fire support, blasted pillboxes, and engaged in roles they weren't designed for. They also pointed out that many crews preferred the older, heavier M10 tank destroyer. The M10 had better crew comfort, more storage space, thicker armour. Its 3-inch gun, while not as powerful as the M18's 76mm, was still effective against most German armour, and the M10 was more survivable when things went wrong. These criticisms weren't wrong, but they missed the larger point. The M18 Hellcat achieved the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American tank or tank destroyer in World War II. Total kills claimed were 526, 498 in Europe, 17 in Italy, 11 in the Pacific. The kill-to-loss ratio in Europe was 2.3 to 1. Overall, it was 2.4 to 1. No other American armoured vehicle came close. Those numbers weren't achieved by accident. They were the result of a design philosophy that prioritised speed and firepower over protection, combined with crews who learned to exploit those advantages. The Hellcat forced its crews to fight smart. They couldn't rely on armour to save them if they made mistakes. They had to use terrain, manoeuvre, speed, surprise. Those who learned these lessons became incredibly effective. By early 1945, 12 tank destroyer battalions in the 12th Army Group were equipped with M18s. They continued to rack up kills until the war's end. Distinguished units like the 603rd and 704th Tank Destroyer Battalions each reported destroying upward of 90 enemy armoured vehicles during the European campaign. The fast tank destroyer concept had its limitations. The 76mm gun, while adequate against most German armour when attacking from the flanks, struggled against frontal armour. Late-war German heavy tanks like the King Tiger were essentially immune to the M18's gun from the front, even with HVAP ammunition. The thin armour meant that the Hellcat could never be used in sustained combat. It had to hit and run. Staying in one position too long invited disaster, and the open turret remained problematic. Crews froze in the winter cold, as the air-cooled engine pulled cooling air through the crew compartment, turning the vehicle into, as one crew member put it, a large armour-plated refrigerator. In summer, dust and rain were constant problems, but when used as intended, as a fast-moving tank killer that struck from unexpected angles and disappeared before the enemy could respond, the M18 was devastatingly effective. It forced German tank commanders to worry about their flanks constantly. It turned the Panther's strengths into weaknesses, negating frontal armour advantage by refusing to engage frontally. The M18 Hellcat remained in production until October 1944. A total of 2,507 were built. Originally, plans called for nearly 9,000 to be produced, but changing priorities and the development of the heavier M36 tank destroyer mounting a 90mm gun led to production being cut short. After the war, the M18 was quickly retired from American service. The tank destroyer force itself was disbanded, as the Army concluded that separate tank destroyer units were unnecessary. Future tanks would handle anti-tank duties themselves. But the M18 continued serving with Allied nations for decades. Italy, Greece, Taiwan and Yugoslavia all used Hellcats, with some remaining in service until the 1990s. Bosnian Serb forces used M18s during the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, making it one of the longest-serving armoured vehicles in history. The lessons of the M18 Hellcat remained relevant long after the vehicle itself became obsolete. It proved that in armoured warfare, speed and manoeuvrability could be as important as firepower and protection. It demonstrated that crews trained to exploit a vehicle's specific advantages could overcome significant disadvantages. It showed that unconventional designs, even those that seemed dangerously vulnerable on paper, could be devastatingly effective when used correctly. Modern tank destroyers and light armoured vehicles still follow principles pioneered by the M18. High mobility, powerful guns relative to vehicle weight, reliance on speed rather than armour for survival. The concept of the fast tank killer never really died, it just evolved. At the National Armour and Cavalry Museum, a restored M18 Hellcat sits among the legendary tanks of World War II. Visitors can read its specifications, see photos of it in action, watch gun camera footage of its kills. But the real story isn't in the specifications or the footage, it's in what the Hellcat represented. It represented American willingness to try radical concepts, to build vehicles that broke conventional wisdom. It represented the principle that there's more than one way to win a tank battle. Most of all, it represented the courage of the crews who took these lightly armoured, open-topped tank destroyers into combat against the most powerful tanks Germany could field, and won more often than they lost. There's a quote from an unnamed German tank commander, recorded in a 1945 interrogation, displayed next to the museum's Hellcat. The speed of the American Hellcat was the most unsettling thing we faced. You would engage what you thought was one or two of them, and suddenly they would be firing from 3 different positions. They refused to fight the way tanks should fight. They were like wolves, attacking from the flanks, from behind, disappearing before you could respond. Our tanks were stronger, theirs were faster. In the end, faster proved more important. That simple statement captures the essence of the M18 Hellcat's success. It wasn't the strongest. It wasn't the best protected. It wasn't even the most powerful gun on the battlefield. But it was the fastest. And in the close-quarters combat of Western Europe, in the forests and villages and rolling countryside where the war was actually fought, speed was the advantage that mattered most. The 4 M18 Hellcats that raced to Nouville in December 1944, the platoons that destroyed Panthers in the fog at Aracourt, the crews that fought throughout the European campaign with the fastest tracked vehicle of the war, proved that sometimes the race goes to the swift. Sometimes the fastest gun is the last gun standing. That was the lesson of the M18 Hellcat, a lesson written in the wreckage of German armour scattered across France, Belgium and Germany. A lesson that German Panther commanders learned the hard way. When American speed met German steel, speed won. The performance of the M18 at Nouville and Aracourt fundamentally changed how American commanders viewed the tank destroyer concept. By January 1945, more units were requesting Hellcats specifically, not just any tank destroyer. The word had spread through the armoured divisions. If you needed something killed quickly, if you needed firepower that could keep up with a rapidly advancing spearhead, you wanted M18s. The 630th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with Hellcats, became legendary during Third Army's drive across Germany in early 1945. Operating with the 11th Armoured Division, they developed tactics that would become the standard for all M18 units. They called it the 3 Ps: position, punch, and peel. Find a good firing position with cover and concealment, hit the enemy hard with the first shot, then get out before they could respond. Staff Sergeant James Withers of the 630th described the tactic in a post-war interview. You never stayed in one place more than a minute or two. Fire 2, maybe 3 shots maximum, then move. The Germans learned real fast that if they saw an M18, it wouldn't be there by the time they got their gun around. We'd be 200 yards away in a different position. It drove them crazy. They never knew where we'd pop up next. The speed wasn't just about tactical movement. It was about operational mobility, the ability to move long distances quickly and arrive ready to fight. In March 1945, during Third Army's breakthrough at Oppenheim and the race to the Rhine, M18 battalions covered over 100 miles in less than 48 hours, keeping pace with the fastest armoured columns. Sherman tanks, cruising at 25 miles per hour, couldn't match that pace. The M10 tank destroyer, based on the Sherman chassis, was even slower. Only the M18 could stay with the lead elements, providing immediate anti-tank capability wherever it was needed. This operational speed proved critical during the exploitation phase of operations. When American forces broke through German defences, the key was to keep moving before the Germans could establish new defensive lines. Armoured spearheads would race forward, bypassing strong points, seizing bridges and road junctions. But these spearheads were vulnerable to German counterattacks, particularly from the heavy tanks that Germany still fielded in significant numbers. The M18s could race forward with the spearheads, providing insurance against Panther or Tiger ambushes. If German armour appeared, threatening to cut off an American advance, the Hellcats were there within minutes. Their speed meant they could respond to threats faster than any other anti-tank asset. During the Rhine crossing operations in March 1945, the 634th Tank Destroyer Battalion, another M18-equipped unit, demonstrated this capability perfectly. On March 25th, supporting the 87th Infantry Division's bridgehead near Boppard, they received word that German armour was forming up for a counterattack. The Hellcats, positioned 5 miles behind the front lines, raced forward and were in defensive positions within 15 minutes. When a dozen Panthers and assault guns hit the bridgehead 30 minutes later, they ran straight into the Hellcat ambush. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. 7 German tanks were destroyed, the rest withdrew. The counterattack was broken before it could gain momentum. The speed that saved the bridgehead wasn't top speed on a straightaway. It was the ability to accelerate rapidly from a standing start, to maintain high speeds over rough terrain, to position quickly and be ready to fire immediately. The Continental R975 engine, the same engine used in some variants of the Sherman tank, provided more than enough power. But in the lighter M18, that power translated to performance that heavier vehicles couldn't match. The engine itself was a marvel of reliability. The air-cooled radial design meant no vulnerable cooling systems, no radiators that could be punctured, no coolant that could leak out. German tankers feared hitting American Sherman tanks in the engine compartment because the diesel fuel or gasoline could ignite, but the M18's engine was far less prone to fire. The radial configuration distributed heat more effectively, and the lack of coolant meant one less combustible fluid in the vehicle. Maintenance was surprisingly straightforward given the vehicle's complexity. The engine could be removed in the field by a trained crew in under 4 hours. The entire power pack, engine and transmission together rolled out on rails built into the hull. No need for a crane or specialised lifting equipment. A crew with hand tools and a block and tackle could swap out a damaged engine and have the vehicle running again by the end of the day. This field maintainability was critical. Tank destroyers were expected to operate forward with the armoured divisions, often separated from rear area maintenance facilities by dozens of miles. The ability to repair and maintain vehicles in the field meant higher operational readiness rates. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, maintained an average operational readiness of 87% throughout their time in combat, higher than most tank battalions. The transmission was equally impressive, though it caused problems early in the vehicle's service life. The Torquematic automatic transmission, a hydraulic system similar to those used in Buick automobiles, was revolutionary for a tracked vehicle. Most tanks of the era used manual transmissions with anywhere from 4 to 8 gears. Shifting required skill and practice. Poor shifting could strip gears, burn out clutches, or cause the vehicle to lurch at exactly the wrong moment in combat. The automatic transmission in the M18 eliminated those problems. The driver controlled direction and speed, but the transmission handled gear selection automatically. This made the vehicle easier to drive, reduced driver fatigue, and meant that less experienced drivers could operate the vehicle effectively. But the early Torquematic transmissions had problems. They were complex, requiring precise adjustment and quality hydraulic fluid. In the field, with dirt and debris getting into the system, they could fail catastrophically. Several M18s were lost to mechanical breakdowns rather than enemy action during the first months of combat operations. Buick engineers worked frantically to identify and fix the problems. By late 1944, improved seals and filtration systems had largely solved the reliability issues. Later production M18s had transmission failure rates comparable to manual transmission vehicles, but the reputation for mechanical problems lingered. Some units requested the M10 specifically because they didn't trust the M18's transmission. The other chronic problem was the track system. The M18 used rubber bush tracks, lighter than the steel tracks on most tanks. This reduced weight and improved ride quality, but the rubber bushings wore out quickly under combat conditions. Track life on the M18 averaged around 1,500 miles, about half that of Sherman tank tracks. Replacing tracks in the field was time-consuming and required the vehicle to be stationary for several hours. During rapid advances, M18s sometimes had to be left behind due to worn-out tracks, later recovered by maintenance units. But these mechanical issues, while frustrating, didn't fundamentally undermine the vehicle's effectiveness. When an M18 was running, it was a deadly weapon, and most of the time they were running. The crews themselves were another critical factor in the Hellcat's success. Tank destroyer units received specialized training that emphasized initiative, independence, and aggressive action. Unlike tank crews, who were trained to support infantry and work as part of larger formations, tank destroyer crews were taught to think of themselves as hunters. Their job was to find enemy armor and kill it, whatever that took. The training emphasized speed and surprise over coordinated action. In exercises, M18 crews practiced rapid deployment from march column to combat formation, practiced shoot and scoot tactics, practiced moving through difficult terrain at high speed. They learned to read terrain, to identify good firing positions that offered cover and multiple exit routes. They learned that staying alive meant staying mobile. The crew of an M18 consisted of 5 men: the commander, who directed the vehicle and made tactical decisions; the gunner, who aimed and fired the main gun; the loader, who handled ammunition; the driver, who operated the vehicle; and the assistant driver, who manned the .50 caliber machine gun and helped the driver navigate. In combat, these 5 men had to work together with absolute precision. The commander identified targets and gave firing orders. The driver positioned the vehicle and prepared to move on command. The gunner acquired the target, adjusted for range and movement, and fired. The loader selected the appropriate ammunition type and loaded it into the breech, and the assistant driver watched for infantry threats while helping spot targets. When everything worked correctly, the crew could engage a target, fire, and be moving again in under 20 seconds. That kind of speed required trust, training, and experience. Green crews were slow, hesitant, likely to make mistakes. Veteran crews operated like a machine, each man anticipating what the others needed. The difference between a green crew and a veteran crew could mean the difference between life and death. The 76mm M1A1 gun was the same weapon mounted on late-model Sherman tanks, but in the M18 it performed differently. The lighter vehicle meant more recoil, but the recoil system was carefully designed to keep the gun on target. The hydraulic recoil mechanism absorbed most of the shock, and the gun returned to battery quickly, ready for another shot. The gun could fire up to 20 aimed shots per minute in the hands of a well-trained crew, though such rates of fire were rarely sustained in combat. More typical was one shot every 6 to 8 seconds, allowing time for the gunner to reacquire the target and adjust aim. The ammunition storage in the M18 was a compromise between capacity and safety. The vehicle carried 45 rounds of 76mm ammunition stored in racks around the turret basket and in the hull. This was considerably less than the 97 rounds carried by a Sherman tank, but more than the 34 rounds in an M10 tank destroyer. The limited ammunition meant that M18 crews had to be selective about their shots. They couldn't afford to spray fire like infantry machine guns. Each round had to count. This encouraged the precise aimed fire that made the Hellcat so deadly. Crews learned to wait for clean shots, to hold fire until they were certain of a hit. The ammunition types available gave the M18 flexibility. The standard armour-piercing M62 round could penetrate 88mm of armour at 1,000 yards. Against the side armour of most German tanks, this was more than adequate. High explosive rounds were used against soft targets like trucks, buildings, or infantry positions. The gun could fire white phosphorus rounds for marking targets, or creating smoke screens, and when available, the high-velocity armour-piercing rounds with tungsten cores could penetrate even heavy armour. But HVAP ammunition remained scarce throughout the war. Production never met demand, and priority went to units facing the heaviest German armour. An M18 battalion might receive a few dozen HVAP rounds per month, rationed carefully among the crews. Standing orders were to use HVAP only against heavy tanks that couldn't be penetrated by standard ammunition. Against Panthers, Tigers, King Tigers, the tungsten core rounds were sometimes the only option. The 50 caliber machine gun mounted on the turret ring provided anti-aircraft and anti-infantry defense. Unlike the coaxial machine guns on tanks, which fired forward in line with the main gun, the 50 caliber on the M18 was manually aimed by the assistant driver. This made it less useful in fast-moving combat, but it gave the crew a powerful defensive weapon. The 50 caliber could penetrate light armor, suppress enemy infantry, and engage low-flying aircraft. Several M18 crews reported shooting down German fighters that made strafing runs on American columns. The heavy machine gun, with its long range and hitting power, was respected and feared by German infantry, who learned to keep their distance from Hellcats. The lack of a coaxial machine gun was a significant disadvantage in certain situations. When engaging bunkers or buildings with infantry inside, the main gun was often too powerful, destroying the entire structure when the crew just wanted to suppress enemy fire. A coaxial machine gun could have provided sustained fire without expending 76mm rounds. Some crews improvised by mounting additional machine guns, usually 30 caliber weapons scavenged from destroyed vehicles in makeshift mounts inside the turret. These field modifications weren't officially sanctioned, but commanders generally looked the other way. Anything that kept crews alive and fighting was acceptable. The open-top turret, initially seen as the M18's greatest weakness, had both advantages and disadvantages that became clear through combat experience. The obvious disadvantage was vulnerability. Artillery airbursts, grenades, small arms fire from elevated positions, even shrapnel from nearby explosions could kill or wound crew members. During street fighting in German cities, snipers targeted M18 crews, forcing them to button up by crouching low in the turret, which reduced visibility and made fighting much harder. In winter, the open top meant crews were exposed to freezing temperatures. In the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, temperatures dropped well below 0 Fahrenheit. The crew compartment offered no protection from wind, snow, or cold. Crews wore every piece of clothing they could find, wrapped themselves in blankets, but still suffered from exposure. Frostbite was a constant problem. Several crew members had to be evacuated due to cold injuries. But the open turret also provided significant advantages that tankers in closed vehicles envied. Visibility was dramatically better. Crew members could see in all directions without relying on periscopes or vision blocks. They could hear approaching vehicles, could communicate with infantry outside the vehicle easily, could orient themselves quickly in confusing situations. In the close terrain of Western Europe, where sightlines were often measured in tens of yards rather than hundreds, this situational awareness was critical. Closed turret tanks frequently lost track of their surroundings, unable to see infantry approaching from the sides, unable to hear warnings shouted by nearby friendly troops. M18 crews could see and hear everything around them. Escape from a disabled vehicle was also much easier with an open turret. If an M18 took a hit that didn't kill the crew immediately, they could bail out in seconds, simply climbing over the turret ring and jumping off the vehicle. Tank crews in closed turrets had to find hatches, open them, and climb through, a process that could take precious seconds they didn't have if the vehicle was on fire. The M18's crew survival rate, despite its thin armour, was relatively high because crews could abandon damaged vehicles so quickly. Some M18 veterans later said they preferred the open turret despite its disadvantages. The improved visibility and easier escape outweighed the vulnerability to small arms fire and weather. Others hated it, feeling naked and exposed, wishing for the protection of enclosed armour. It largely depended on individual temperament and the specific combat situations each crew faced. The German perspective on the M18 evolved significantly as the war progressed. Early encounters, like those at Arikour, shocked German tank commanders who had expected American armour to be slow and predictable. Intelligence reports from late 1944 described the M18 as a dangerous opponent that required specific tactics to counter. German tactical doctrine developed in response emphasized several key points. Never allow M18s to reach your flanks. Engage them at long range where their thin armour could be penetrated easily and their gun was less effective. Use terrain to limit their mobility advantage. Force them into positions where they had to fight frontally. Infantry should target the exposed crews with rifle and machine gun fire. These were sound tactics in principle, but difficult to execute in practice. By late 1944, the German army was short on experienced tank crews, short on fuel, short on operational vehicles. German tanks often couldn't maneuver to prevent American flanking attacks because they lacked the fuel for extensive movement. They couldn't always choose engagement ranges because the tactical situation forced them into close-range combat. German infantry were frequently pinned down or bypassed by rapid American advances, unable to coordinate with armour. One German tank commander, Hauptmann Klaus Meyer, who survived the war and was interviewed in the 1980s, described his experiences fighting M18s during the defence of the Rhine. They were ghosts. You would see one, acquire it with your gun, and before you could fire, it was gone. Then it would appear somewhere else and kill one of your tanks. We lost 5 Panthers in one day to what we thought was a company of American tank destroyers. After the battle, prisoners told us it was 4 vehicles. Just 4. But they moved so fast, fired so accurately, that we thought we faced 20. The speed was the most demoralizing thing. Our Panthers were powerful, well-armoured, with excellent guns, but we felt helpless against an enemy that refused to fight the way tanks should fight. Meyer's experience was common among German tankers in the last months of the war. The combination of American air superiority, artillery support, and fast-moving armour like the M18 created an environment where German tactical advantages meant less and less. The Panther might be superior in a stand-up fight, but American forces rarely gave them stand-up fights. The M18's performance in the Pacific Theatre was less celebrated but equally effective. The 632nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M18s, arrived in the Philippines in early 1945. The terrain, with its jungles, rice paddies and mountains, seemed completely unsuited to the fast tank destroyer. But the battalion found ways to make it work. The speed that made the M18 deadly in Europe was less useful in the Philippines, where roads were few and often impassable, but the powerful gun was invaluable. Japanese fortifications built into caves and bunkers could shrug off small arms fire and even tank guns. The 76mm gun on the M18, firing high explosive rounds, could blast through concrete and stone, collapsing bunkers and sealing cave entrances. The Japanese had few tanks left by 1945, so the M18s were rarely used in their designed anti-tank role. Instead, they became mobile artillery, providing direct fire support for infantry assaults. The high explosive shells were devastating against Japanese positions. A single hit could collapse a bunker, kill everyone inside, and demoralize nearby defenders. During the Battle for Manila, M18s from the 622nd supported the 1st Cavalry Division's assault into the city. The tank destroyers, moving through rubble-filled streets, provided covering fire for infantry, blasted Japanese strongpoints, and even engaged Japanese positions across the Pasig River with indirect fire. One M18 crew reportedly fired over 400 rounds during the month-long battle, far more than any crew in Europe expended in a single engagement. The Japanese, with no effective anti-tank weapons available in significant numbers, found the M18s nearly impossible to stop. Suicide attackers with magnetic mines or satchel charges were the primary threat, but the open turret actually helped defend against these attacks. Crew members could see attackers approaching and engage them with the .50 caliber machine gun or personal weapons. After the Philippines campaign, some M18 battalions were slated for the invasion of Japan. The plans called for massive armoured support for the amphibious landings and subsequent fighting. The M18, with its speed and firepower, would have played a significant role. But the atomic bombs and Japanese surrender in August 1945 meant the invasion never happened. The handful of M18 battalions in the Pacific returned home without seeing further combat. In Europe, the war ended in May 1945 with M18 battalions scattered across Germany and Austria. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, which had been among the first to receive Hellcats and had fought from Normandy to Bavaria, ended the war with over 200 confirmed kills and just 37 M18s lost to all causes. The 603rd Tank Destroyer Battalion claimed 140 kills for the loss of 29 vehicles. The 630th claimed 97 kills for 17 losses. These kill-to-loss ratios far exceeded those of Sherman tank battalions, or M10 equipped tank destroyer battalions. The numbers validated everything the M18's designers had hoped for. Speed and firepower had proven more important than armour in the European theatre. But the victory came at a cost. Tank destroyer doctrine, which had called for massed anti-tank units to defeat Panzer breakthroughs, had rarely been used as intended. Most M18 battalions spent the war attached to infantry divisions providing direct support, fighting more like tanks than specialised tank destroyers. The separate tank destroyer force seemed unnecessary when tanks could perform the same missions. In 1946, the Army disbanded the Tank Destroyer Centre and integrated tank destroyer battalions into the armoured force. The M18 Hellcat, along with the M10 and M36, was declared obsolete and surplused. Thousands of Hellcats were scrapped, melted down for their metal. A few were retained for training or display. Some were sold to foreign militaries. Within 5 years of war's end, the M18 had virtually disappeared from American service. But its influence continued. The concept of the fast, lightly armoured tank killer never died. In the 1960s, the Army experimented with air-mobile anti-tank systems, helicopters armed with missiles that could strike enemy armour and escape quickly. The philosophy was pure M18, speed and firepower over armour. In the 1980s, the Marine Corps developed the Light Armoured Vehicle, or LAVV, with a variant mounting a 105mm gun. Fast, wheeled, lightly armoured, designed to hit and run. Again, the M18's influence was clear. Modern armies still struggle with the same question the M18 tried to answer. In an age of heavy, expensive main battle tanks, is there a role for lighter, faster, cheaper tank killers? Some nations have answered yes. The Italian Centauro, the South African Ruikat, the Chinese Type 09, all are wheeled vehicles with large guns, designed for speed and mobility rather than protection. They're spiritual successors to the Hellcat, proving the concept still has validity. The M18 itself lived on in foreign service for decades. The Italians used Hellcats into the 1970s. The Taiwanese kept them in service until the early 1990s, finally retiring the last examples in 1994, nearly 50 years after they were built. In Yugoslavia, M18s saw combat during the breakup of that nation in the 1980s. Bosnian Serb forces, equipped with Hellcats from old Yugoslav stocks, used them as mobile artillery and assault guns. Against lightly armed opponents, the 76mm gun was still effective. The speed, even on 50-year-old vehicles, remained impressive. Several M18s were destroyed during the fighting, finally ending their combat careers half a century after they were designed. Today, perhaps 24 M18 Hellcats survive in museums and private collections around the world. Several are in running condition, maintained by collectors who appreciate their historical significance. At tank rallies and living history events, these survivors demonstrate the speed and agility that made them famous. Watching a restored Hellcat accelerate from a standstill to 30 miles per hour in seconds, seeing it pivot and reverse with remarkable agility, hearing the distinctive roar of the Continental radial engine, visitors can understand what made the vehicle so effective. The M18 Hellcat was a gamble that paid off. It bet that speed and firepower could defeat armour and protection. It bet that aggressive tactics and well-trained crews could overcome significant vulnerabilities. It bet that American industrial capacity could produce a complex, sophisticated vehicle in quantity and keep it running under combat conditions. All those bets proved correct. The result was a tank destroyer that achieved kill ratios no other American armoured vehicle could match, that struck fear into German tank crews from the Ardennes to Bavaria, that proved speed could be the most important armour of all. When the last M18 fired its last shot in combat, somewhere in the Balkans in the 1990s, it ended one of the longest combat careers of any armoured vehicle. From the first engagements in Italy in 1944 to the Yugoslav wars 50 years later, the Hellcat had proven its worth again and again. Not by being the strongest or the most protected, but by being the fastest. In the end, that was enough. More than enough.